Welcome, everybody. This is our session, our next session as part of our international CILT focus on digitalisation in the supply chain, where over the next few months we're doing a number of interviews and a number of webinars to look at the adoption of digital technology in the supply chain and to pick up various themes and questions around that. And it's with great pleasure today that I can welcome Ed Sweeney, Professor Ed Sweeney, who has just recently joined Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh from Aston University in Birmingham. Ed leads the Heriot-Watt University Operations Management and Logistics team, and his research is based in the Centre for Logistics and Sustainability. Ed is an engineer by background, and Ed has over 30 years global supply chain experience in business, academia and consultancy, with particular expertise in effective technology deployment. So our in conversation today is going to, I'm sure, be far-ranging and cover the subject in an interesting manner for you. So stand back and I'll ask the questions, but the floor will be with Ed. And Ed, we're really looking forward to talking to you about this subject quite at the early stage within our range of events and activities that we've got planned. So Ed, can I start? I think it would be best to start really just to for you just to give us a quick overview about your career, how you've been involved in logistics and the supply chain, and particularly about your association with the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, CILT.
Hi Keith, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. I feel quite old when I tell my students that I graduated from university with my first degree in engineering in 1986, so fully 35 years ago. And I've worked in the supply chain one way or another since then, really, as you mentioned, in a variety of business roles. I spent most of my early career in the automotive and aerospace businesses, moving into consultancy, and I worked for a while at Warwick Manufacturing Group in Coventry, spent some time working in the Far East as well towards the end of the 1990s, which was an interesting experience. I've worked in my home country in Dublin for many years, returning back to the UK in 2014 to join Aston University. And it's from Aston University that I recently moved back into the Celtic part of these islands to Edinburgh and to Heriot-Watt University. My association with CILT, I think, goes back to probably one of the predecessor organizations, that's the Institute of Logistics. And you and I will remember Ian Canadyne's tenure in charge of that organization. So I guess that would have been late 80s, early 90s when I had my first association with that organization. I've been a member of CILT and its predecessor institutions in Malaysia, in Ireland, and I was honoured to have been made the Member of the Year for CILT Ireland in 2013, just before I returned to the UK. When I joined Aston and arrived in Birmingham in 2014, I almost immediately became very active in the West Midlands region, and have continued in that mode up until recently. And in 2015, I was elected by my peers as chairman of the Logistics Research Network. So I've had 6 years now of chairing a fantastic group of fellow academics from over 20 institutions around the UK, and in fact just a few weeks ago, we hosted, our friends in Cardiff University actually hosted our 25th annual conference. Sadly, it was online. It was a great event, but we look forward hugely to the return of the physical LRN annual conference in 2022.
Thanks, Ed. And yeah, as that's interesting as you reflect back over the years. I think we've got many common themes in terms of both going back into the 80s, but also the association with CILT over that period of time, and back into with the Institute of Logistics, which was similar for me. But we're in some really interesting times. Interesting is perhaps the right word. But in logistics and supply chain globally. Let me ask you the first question that sort of will test this. Do you think it's time now for notoriety or time for opportunity for supply chain professionals?
I think it's a little bit of both in a sense, Keith, because I suspect that it's from the notoriety, if you wish to call it that it's from that the opportunity arises. We have for many years, haven't we, moaned about the fact that our supply chain profession tends to be very, very invisible until something goes wrong. We end up with a supply disruption of some kind, and then suddenly our supply chain and the logistics that underpins those supply chains suddenly becomes invisible for all the wrong reasons. So we will remember a few years back when we had the Kentucky Fried Chicken problem, which of course that particular company turned into an incredible marketing and communication triumph. And you remember around the same time, we had the shortage of carbon dioxide, which happened in the middle of one of the warmest summers that we ever had. It meant we had beer, we had pubs full of empty beer kegs and lack of soft drinks and all the rest of it. So we've seen a lot more of that in recent times. So we you know, this week we're speaking, we can see several examples of it. The fuel shortage perhaps been the most high profile one. So I think the reality is that most of our supply chains work really, really well most of the time, but that goes unnoticed. And it's just occasionally when things go wrong for a whole variety of reasons, often the sort of so-called perfect storm, that things become more obvious, and our profession perhaps gains an element of the notoriety to which your question referred. However, I think we also need to reflect back on some of the other big sort of challenges which we see in business. I mean, like if we go back about 5 years ago when we were talking about the Brexit question, a lot of the Brexit debate was fundamentally about trade flows internationally. And I think when we began to have a public debate about customs union and about the single market and so forth, logistics and supply chain issues of necessity and by definition were front and center of that debate. So really, if we go back to that period, we can see the beginnings of logistics and supply chain management been the center of media attention, been the center of political debate and all the rest of it. And if we bring the clock a bit more up to date, when we had the beginnings of the pandemic 18 months ago, again, we saw our profession in the headlines very often for very, very positive reasons. So you will remember when we had massive success in terms of following some initial challenges, the rollout of PPE to tens of thousands of usage points across the country. I remember when we had the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine administered to Margaret Keenan in Coventry. I mean, this was an incredible supply chain triumph, really, and particularly given the ultra cold requirements in terms of storage and transportation of that particular vaccine. So, you know, never before has supply chain and logistics been very much at the center of public debate. And I think we can, in some ways, turn that to our advantage because it gives us an opportunity. I think, a unique and unrivaled opportunity to explain to people what our fantastic profession is really about. And I think there are some signs that that is working, because at Aston University, for example, an institution with which I worked for almost 10 years, in the 2021-22 academic year, the intake of undergraduate and postgraduate students into logistics and supply chain programs was at an all-time high, or certainly a high for recent times. So I think we see a lot more interest in and knowledge of what we do as a direct result of some of the negative, notorious things, to go back to your use of the word notoriety, but also as a result of some of the really effective work that's been done in a more positive way by our colleagues across the profession.
So yes, I agree with you in many respects that there's, although we're right at the forefront, aren't we, of many of the news stories at the moment, and have been over the, as you rightfully point out, back over the COVID crisis. A lot of that gave us some very good press out there in terms of how we coped, and your emphasis there very much on the opportunity. I wonder too, as well, as we look at certainly the last 18 months, how important the global element has been in the supply chain, and how that has started to come out. What's your perspective on that? I know, importantly, you've just released the 8th edition of the book Global Logistics. I was surprised it was the 8th edition with Kogan Page, but the global aspect of supply chain, do you see that as being very critical at this point in time?
Yes, I do, Keith. And, you know, I often say to people that when I reflect back on the last 30 years of working in supply chain roles, probably the biggest single thing which has changed is the supply chains within which I was working back in the 1980s and into the early 90s were largely local, or at best regional, in terms of geographical complexion. But the supply chains within which I'm working now in the 2020s are very international, in some cases genuinely global. So we've seen this shift from sort of local to global in terms of supply chain architectures. And of course, that brings a degree of complexity with which we didn't have to deal with back in the 80s and 90s. And incidentally, that transformation hasn't happened by accident. It's happened, of course, as a direct consequence of significant structural change in the international economic and business environment, particularly the growth and development of trade blocs, of free trade agreements between countries and regions, and a general, notwithstanding some recent developments, but a general trend over a period of time towards reducing barriers to the movement of products and services and people and capital and knowledge across international borders. So the global supply chains haven't kind of happened by accident. They've happened as a direct consequence of these bigger kind of political and economic trends. So, and incidentally, we do hear quite a bit now about deglobalization. And in fact, in the Global Logistics book to which you referred, the very final chapter in that book is about deglobalization. My sense of this is that, yes, we have seen some sort of reshoring of activity, or nearshoring as it's called, of manufacturing activity, for example, but in general terms, the trend has been and continues to be one which is about internationalization and in some cases globalization. So that kind of global context is not something which is going to disappear anytime soon. Now, of course, that brings challenges for all of us, because as supply chain professionals, we need not only to understand the nuts and bolts of our professional area in terms of inventory management and logistics planning and all those things that hopefully we're quite proficient at, but we need to understand the bigger picture in terms of international politics, international culture, and, you know, building international teams that collaborate across boundaries, international borders, and which are really effective and sustainable. So, I know that CILT International has been very much at the forefront in terms of sort of facilitating some of those, some of those skill sets that we need to operate effectively in this brave new world.
Yeah, well, that's really the backdrop that I wanted to then take us into in terms of the subject today, which is disruptive digital technology adoption in global supply chains. So I'm going to take us now sort of into that subject really. In the course of the last 18 months, 2 years, that there are a number of, as you've outlined, a number of factors, a number of changes, a number of issues, a number of barriers, a number of opportunities. But what do you think are the main factors now in this post-COVID supply chain world that will encourage the adoption of new digital technologies?
I think there are a few things which are important. I think if we go back to the essence of what contemporary supply chain management really is about, to me, in one word, it's about integration. It's about shifting away from the sort of highly fragmented supply chain architectures, which were a feature of the landscape when you and I began our careers, towards sort of configurations and supply chain architectures which are characterized by much higher levels of integration. So the need to do things in a much more joined up way. I think for those of us actively involved in this area, that's been apparent for some time, but if anything, the pandemic period has shone a new light on that. So we need to do things in a more joined up and integrated way. Now, if we accept that, particularly in an international context, where where collaboration across borders is vitally important, technology is the key enabler of this. And to me, that's really the key message, and it's a message which it took me a while to learn really as an engineer. I think sometimes there is a danger that we see technology as a panacea, as a silver bullet, as a sort of magic solution to all of the problems that we have, and people like myself who come from technology backgrounds are perhaps in danger of falling into that trap. But I think the key thing we've got to think about is, what is it we want to achieve from a business and a supply chain point of view, in terms of the old things that we all know about, meeting customer requirements consistently and in a way which allows us to be profitable, and increasingly to do that in a way which is environmentally sustainable. So we need to have absolute clarity on what it is we need to achieve from a business point of view, and then begin to think about, well, how can technology help to enable the supply chains that we need to achieve those objectives? So the role of technology as a facilitator or an enabler of cost effectiveness, of customer satisfaction, and in particular achieving high levels of customer service, and the role of technology as an enabler of environmental sustainability. I think that's really the key message, which we've been learning over a number of years, but I think which the last 18 months have made even more apparent for us.
So as professionals, and the audience out there today, the global audience we're looking at, you're encouraging thinking in a joined up way, seeing technology as a key enabler. And then you touched on there, didn't you, the need for a clear business viewpoint in that. And that mirrored actually very much what Professor Rob Franklin was saying from when he and I talked on a webinar a couple of weeks ago, about the need to apply a business view to opportunities like blockchain, like Internet of Things, like artificial intelligence, and then thinking back to our experiences in terms of treating technology often in isolation as a solution, rather than looking at the wider how do you apply this and how do you apply this successfully for a business. Do you think we've learned the lessons in the supply chain in terms of some of the mistakes that have historically happened by seeing technology just as the immediate answer without applying that wider business view?
I think we've certainly learned some of those lessons. I mean, some would have been permeating a bit more slowly than perhaps we would have liked. I mean, for example, one of the things we see in a lot of the work we do with our industry partners is that the sort of global supply chains, in terms of how they're configured, are often simply too complex. They're more complex than they need to be. So a lot of our supply chain re-engineering and our supply chain improvement processes are about replacing excessive, and I use my words carefully, excessive complexity with relative simplicity. And the concept really is that the world around us is complex enough in so many different ways. You know, we've got complex markets with sophisticated, very discerning customers who want more and more in terms of value and in terms of capability, downward pressure on prices because of hyper competition. So we live in a complex world, so let's not unnecessarily make it even more complex than it needs to be. Now, I think if I go back to the 90s and 90s, one of the things we did badly was we often tried to deal with the complexity conundrum by putting in IT solutions. So in other words, we take a complex supply chain, we set a complex piece of technology on top of that complex supply chain, and we often accentuate the problems that we had rather than solving them. So going back to the old issue of integration, in that sort of context, the ineffective deployment of technology accentuates fragmentation rather than accelerates integration, and that's a big problem. At much more operational level, and I've seen this happening in logistics organizations, we've seen it happening on the shop floor in manufacturing companies, for example. You know, if I have a bad process anywhere in the supply chain, an intrinsically badly designed process, and I automate that process, what I really end up with is perhaps a slightly faster bad process. You know, so I think one of the key messages is let's make sure we redesign what we're doing in the supply chain, and that goes across the boundaries of different companies. We cannot just think about that in the context of what goes on within the four walls of a single organization. So the focus needs to be on understanding what the supply chain needs to look like, and as part of that, as an integrated part of that, trying to understand what the role of technology is. And too often in the past, I think we've separated these two things. We've been thinking about, look, what should the supply chain look like? And, you know, once we've done that, and we've perhaps as an afterthought begun to think about some of the enabling technology, or even worse, and I think we've all seen this, a company will make a decision to commit significant financial resources into a new ERP system, for example, and then we kind of redesign the supply chain to almost suit the functionality of the ERP system. Now that makes no sense, and they were lessons that we learned in many sectors the hard way. You know, these were difficult lessons. I think we were slow to learn some of the lessons, but we have learned a huge amount over the last 10 years, I believe. I also think that if we look at the logistics sector specifically, traditionally, I think it's probably fair to say that the IT sector wasn't really a great servant to the logistics industry. And there's a lot of research around on this in terms of trying to understand what the underlying reasons might be. But what I see happening in a much more effective way in 2021 compared to 10 years ago is logistics organizations working much more comfortably with their technology vendors. And in particular working in a much more collaborative way with technology vendors to jointly develop solutions that work for everyone and ultimately that work from a customer point of view, because that really is that will really be the ultimate measure of the success or failure of any of these things.
Mm. And yeah, so I mean that was a great sort of walk through really some of the lessons learned, as you said, over the last really now nearly 30 years in terms of applying solutions and technology as in a narrow way, and now your understanding is and your experience is that we are learning those lessons as we go, and we're seeking to do this in a much more joined up way, as you described right at the start, I think, of the answer to that question. And you use the word collaboration. So let's get into the collaboration side, because I think you're very right in terms of typically ERP solutions, technical solutions were viewed at by a single business. There would be a business case, probably driven very much by the IT supplier, that would go and get agreed to, and then when it was put in place, we'd forgotten about how that linked in with the customer, or with the supplier, or the wider supply chain processes. Currently now, when we look at moving goods internationally, many different businesses and many different partners are involved, and how so collaboration is likely to be increased, but what sort of behaviours do we need to bear in mind, and what sort of opportunities are there in terms of digital technology to enable collaboration to work effectively and deliver collaborative solutions? Very big question, that, Ed. I think it comes into many dimensions, but what's your perspective?
It's a big question, Keith, and it's a really important question. And look, let's just put some focus on around this. Something which we have been working on over the last couple of years, and it perhaps a little bit pre-pandemic, but certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, is something which we refer to as the digital divide in supply chains, and the digital divide in the logistics industry in particular. Now, when we talk about the digital divide in this regard, what we're talking about is the fact that let's think of the logistics industry as for example, because it's an excellent example. We know that the industry, the sector called logistics, is a fragmented one in the sense that we have a very small number of big players, but we have a huge number of small players. Now, all of the evidence that we have, not surprisingly, is telling us that the big players have been powering ahead in terms of investment in digital technologies, in terms of investment in innovation generally, in terms of investment in the skills that we need to effectively deploy that technology. But simultaneously, their SME peers have been not doing that, at least not to the same extent. So you're beginning to see this division opening up, or this divide opening up, which we refer to as the digital divide. Now, that's really, really serious, because look, the first thing we say to our undergraduate supply chain students is the supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. That's why we call it the supply chain. Or to put it another way around, supply chain is only as fast as its slowest link. So if we are inadvertently, as a result of this digital divide, creating weaknesses and vulnerabilities across the supply chain, I mean, everybody ultimately will lose from that. So something we've been promoting very strongly with national government and with devolved administrations and with regional, local enterprise partnerships and so on, is the need for serious investment in terms of supporting the smaller companies, particularly in logistics, but across the wider supply chain, to increase their, what we call the innovation bandwidth, you know. And look, the innovation bandwidth is not just about money, although money is an important dimension to this. We know that the logistics industry, and particularly the smaller players in the industry, operate at perhaps dangerously low levels of profit margin. That is a problem, but there are all kinds of other problems around, for example, what can we do? And I think there's a role for universities and a role for professional bodies in this. What can we do to really just to help smaller organizations to keep abreast of, to be aware of the big developments that are taking place in terms of technology? Look, if I'm a small third-party logistics organization with a handful of employees, simply keeping abreast of the rapid rate of development in terms of digital technology, that in itself is a massive challenge. There are issues around financing. There are issues around how do I choose an appropriate vendor to work with, and develop a collaborative relationship with that vendor. How do I make sense of the whole practical issue around developing the skills and putting the technology into practice, all the project management and implementation stuff. So I think there are a lot of things that we as an ecosystem, that we as a profession can do to support particularly smaller companies to enhance their innovation bandwidth. And that's something which I think is critical to this, because going back to your original point about collaboration, that cross-company collaboration has to be between big players and smaller players. And unless we can increase the innovation bandwidth in the smaller companies, that collaboration becomes very, very difficult. And I mean, the reality is that the approach to effective digital deployment has to cross company boundaries, because, you know, we've seen a big trend that the whole process of sort of vertical disintegration as a result of sort of outsourcing of key activities means that we have supply chain architectures which are very virtual, certainly a long way removed from the old Henry Ford approach, where, you know, he famously said, to control something, I have to own it, and owned everything from sheep farms through to the retail outlets that sold the cars. Now we have supply chains that comprise thousands of different organizations, and integration involves all of the companies. And if we accept that mantra that supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link, we need to be really thinking about the capability and creating the capability we need to make that a reality. Yes,
and I guess you'd also the integration would also apply in the same way, small and large businesses, but equally developing economies and developed economies in exactly the same way. You can't when your product's traveling globally, you can't leave countries behind either, can you, in that sense?
Absolutely, and I think that's a really good point to make. And I think when we began the sort of process of global vertical disintegration in anger 25 years ago, that was perhaps one of the, it shouldn't have been unexpected, but it was one of the kind of downsides that we began to see initially. What's fascinating is that we have research now which looks at both the sort of country level differences, as well as differences in capability by size and differences in capability by sector. And so it's a kind of multi-dimensional, multifaceted piece. And I think, to be honest, Keith, a good way in which my profession, and I mean, as an academic, one of the things we can contribute usefully to this debate is just developing a much better understanding of what is of the dynamics of what is a really complex ecosystem. And if we can do that, that allows key decision makers in that complex ecosystem, I think, to make more informed decisions about the future, including about investment in digital technology. And it also provides us with the kind of information that we can feed in to ensure that public policy making is done in a much more informed and evidence-based fashion.
Yes, excellent, Ed. I think that that's quite a challenge, both for us as CILT and for the academic world, isn't it? And,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think you know, CILT and ourselves in the university system, collaborating with our industrial partners, that's like, there is incredible opportunity here for us to do something which can, you know, really result in a step change improvement in what we do, particularly I think from a sort of sustainability point of view, because, and I mean an environmental sustainability point of view. This is probably very much on my mind at the moment, because I just yesterday attended a couple of excellent webinars on different facets of environmental sustainability. One delivered by Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Julia King, former Vice Chancellor of Aston University, looking at it through the prism of the Climate Change Committee. And you know, the reality is that we are we've got massive challenges ahead in terms of meeting the very ambitious targets which have been set in terms of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonising what we do. And look, we know that activities all across the supply chain do damage to the natural environment, particularly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's true across the supply chain. But if we look at freight transportation in particular, here in the UK, of course, we are very heavily dependent still on road transportation. That in turn is stubbornly dependent on the burning of fossil fuels. So we have a huge job of work ahead of us over the next 5 to 10 years to address that. So when you think about that sustainability challenge, alongside the challenge of keeping customers happy, alongside the challenge of maintaining profitability in our businesses, we've got a hell of a lot to do. And the digital agenda I see as really being one which is not there in addition to all of that, but is there really to support all of that. So it goes back to the point I made, I think, about technology being an enabler of all of this progress, rather than something we should kind of think of as another challenge that we've got to grapple with.
Excellent, Ed. Well, that really does support our drive to tie in sustainability with digitalization, really, as an institute. So thanks for that that endorsement there, because that is such a critical link up, isn't it, and particularly in terms of the challenges ahead. Now, we're getting towards the end of our time, but I know you've been, and you throughout particularly your academic career, your focus has been equipping people to then make a difference in the industry, and you've done that in many ways. Joined up with CILT in different programs. But perhaps we could finish just looking at the skills area within. So with some of the technologies that are coming through, we are looking at a very different supply chain and a very different set of skills that are needed. Do you think we're doing enough in that across the industry, whether that's business, whether that's academia, or whether that's us as a professional body?
I think we're doing a lot. There are always additional things that we could productively do, but you're completely right that the landscape continues to evolve, and it changes quite quickly. And one of the big challenges we have as educators is about making sure that our curricula really are fit for a purpose. Now, my sense of that, Keith, is that the only way we can sensibly do that is by working in close partnership with our friends in business and industry, and indeed in the CILT and professional bodies more broadly. Our kind of guide in all of this remains that idea of the need for what we call the T-shaped professionals, but that's been around for a long time, but I don't think it's ever been more important, because in the old days, I think when I began my career, a lot of our logistics and supply chain training and education was very, very narrowly focused. It was it was about the kind of tools of the trade, the core bread and butter issues. We got very good at, we would do a module on warehouse layout, and we would do a module on inventory optimization, we would do a module on other facets of transport planning and so on. And that's very much the kind of vertical part, or the I part of skills profile. But the horizontal part has become more and more important. So the lesson we've learned really is that to effectively deploy those specialist skills, you need that much wider awareness of politics and culture and human resource issues and strategic thinking and the legal framework and all of that. And as part of that mix, we have to now be equipping, in our case, graduates from bachelor and undergraduate programs with pretty advanced, for example, data analytics skills, with pretty advanced skills in terms of technology. So, what, not just the jargon, but really what is the technology about? What is its functionality? What can it do? What can it not do? And not just about the capability of technology, but also about its effective deployment. So there's a whole piece which I think we can link back to the T-shaped profile. But to us, it's driven by, the need to be sure that our kind of 21st century supply chains are globally connected, that they are globally connected, going back to the previous part of our discussion. So from a skills and knowledge development point of view, that in itself raises huge issues. That global connectivity is facilitated by advanced technology. So there's a whole piece around that. And there's the whole piece around dealing with that environmental sustainability challenge. So I think the global connectivity, technological skills, and the sustainability piece, these are going to be three sort of core areas which will be part of skill development and knowledge development for all supply chain professionals, really, as we look to the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was particularly the way that you finished off linking skills in with the themes that we talked about before was wonderful. And we're going to have to draw it to a close now. We could have kept on talking, I think, for several more hours, but I'm sure this what you've said there and the subjects that we've covered will be of high interest to our professionals around the world, and will, I'm sure, create some discussion and some more themes that we'll talk about over the coming months. So, Professor Ed Sweeney, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Particularly, I know it's a busy time for you in terms of your change environment for Aston to Heriot-Watt, but thank you on behalf of CILT, and all the best, and no doubt we'll be talking again, I'm sure. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith.